Today we're going to have an introduction to Shakespearean play Macbeth. So now we're going to kind of look a bit at the theme. So ask yourself the following. Have you ever given in to temptation? Do you believe in prophecies? How do you personally decide what is good and what is evil? Do you know the difference between greed and ambition? Do you believe you reap what you sow? And do you believe our lives are led by fate, or is it led by actions alone? These questions and more you'll probably be looking at as you start getting into the story of Macbeth. So let's start with the summary. So Macbeth is a dark, relentless tale of a good and brave Scottish general who, encouraged by dark prophecies of three evil witches and by his own wife, he murders the King of Scotland, who is named Duncan. Now Macbeth then becomes king and brings about his own destruction. Now Shakespeare wrote the play for James I, who was England's new king at the time, who had been King of Scotland. So to please James, Shakespeare set the play in Scotland and used many characters who were James's ancestors, and also included witches, a subject that King James had written about himself. Now the play is Shakespeare's shortest tragedy, probably because King James often fell asleep during the performances. Now, Shakespeare's source for the story of Macbeth was the History and Chronicles of Scotland from 1526 that was written by Hector Boyce, a Scottish historian and a humanist. Now, many scholars question the factual reliability of Botch's work and point out that Shakespeare also took liberties with Macbeth's history for dramatic purposes. So what is the history that we know? Well, the King of England in 1606 was James I, and he was from the family called the Stuarts. There was no Tudor successor for the throne of England because Elizabeth I had no children, and therefore she chose James VI of Scotland to succeed her. After her death in 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England. Now, Elizabeth I had been instrumental in the death of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, who had been beheaded. So on her deathbed, Elizabeth wanted to ease her way into heaven, and so she chose Mary's son James to become the next King of England. Now, the appointment of James I was a good political move because it unified England and Scotland under one king. So then Shakespeare comes along and writes Macbeth in 1606 during King James's reign. Now, King James was a devout advocate for the divine right of kings. He decided everything. The setting is Scotland, which is King James's homeland, and Banquo was an ancestor of James and is shown in the play to be quite a virtuous person. And we also, with the witches being as evil as they are, King James believed himself to be an expert on witchcraft, and he also had an interest in faith healing. A lot of these attributes to the story of Macbeth are set up specifically to please King James I. Now, Shakespeare demonstrated the Elizabethan belief that the country is stable only if the king is good and virtuous. And at the time, Elizabethans would believe that evil occurs in darkness, which is a reoccurring theme. We see evil happening during the dark times in Macbeth. Shakespeare also includes a lot of blood and murder, which the Elizabethans expected to see in a play. This would be great entertainment for them. And the play was considered a thriller. A threat to an anointed king and a perceived evil behind a threat was not too far off in the history of most people in England. They would have actually correlated and connected to their own past. So when we take a look at the history of Macbeth itself, do we actually see historical happenings in the story? Yes, but it's loosely based. So when we take a look at MacDonald's rebellion and the invasion of Sweno, they take place at different times in Scotland, but Shakespeare's going to combine them. Duncan, the king, is also supposed to have been killed by 4 hired servants, but Shakespeare has his lead character of Macbeth commit the murder. And history represents Banquo as equal in guilt with Macbeth, whereas Shakespeare makes him a little bit more virtuous. Banquo's character is more of a compliment towards King James I. Now, history makes no mention of Lady Macbeth. Her character is almost wholly the creation of Shakespeare, so any evil that you would have in Macbeth himself is just further personified in the wife. Now, in history, Macbeth fled before Macduff, and then Shakespeare shows Macbeth bravely fighting. So there is a change of history here, whereas we had Macbeth in reality fleeing, but in Shakespearean plays, Macbeth is bravely fighting until the end. And he also used Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland as historical reference for his plays, but again, loosely based on those books. Now, before the curtain opens, there are two wars in progress as the play Macbeth progresses. There is a civil war. King Duncan is fighting MacDonald's rebels. This actually happened in the history of Scotland, but we do see that we're supposed to expect that as the play is beginning. There's also the National War of Scotland being led by King Duncan, invading Norway, which is led by King Sweno. So there's a lot of war. That's why you're going to see most of your major characters being generals or being very warlike. So with our setting, King Duncan is the King of Scotland, and Edward the Confessor is the King of England at the time. The time period is around the 11th century, from about 1000 to 1099. Shakespeare also used poetic license to bend some of the historical information. If he needed to have other battles or other situations happening, he may have fudged a couple of the years. So now, Macbeth is another one of Shakespeare's great tragedies that's based on Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, which was written about 1605 but was not published in the first folio until about 1623. Now, Macbeth tells about the fall of the ambitious couple Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So Macbeth is considered the tragic hero. He's a character who has a fatal and, of course, tragic flaw within himself that he just cannot change. He's not a bad person. He's not the bad guy, per se. He's just considered too ambitious, and that leads to his tragic downfall. Now, Macbeth is a story about the murder of a king by his cousin. It's also the revenge of a son, Malcolm. It's about three witches who plot against Macbeth. And, of course, since the story's about Macbeth, it is his rise and his eventual fall. So the plot overview itself. Well, as we follow through Macbeth, he's an interesting character to follow. We're going to watch how he changes throughout the play. So when we first meet Macbeth, he's a brave soldier, and we later find him as a murderer who kills anyone and everyone who's in his way of the throne. Now, Lady Macbeth is also a well-developed character. She's very conniving and ruthless, more ambitious than her husband, but she does seem to have some humane qualities. Now, the play opens in Scotland. Macbeth and Banquo have defeated their enemies in battle, leading King Duncan to give the title of Thane of Cawdor to Macbeth. Now, he doesn't know that this has happened. Next, Macbeth and Banquo encounter three chanting witches, and the witches speak to Macbeth as Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, and King Hereafter. They also tell Banquo that though he will not be king, he will beget kings. In other words, his sons will be future kings. Now, Macbeth wonders about this prediction as the king's messenger arrives, who then tells him that he's been appointed the Thane of Cawdor. Macbeth is momentarily tempted to kill the king in order to fulfill his prophecy, but he decides to not to and to wait. Lady Macbeth, however, once she hears that there's been a prophecy that he's going to be king, urges her husband to do it immediately. Now, since the king is staying at their own castle overnight, that must be when they kill him. She plans the whole thing, making the king's guards drunk, and by using their daggers to kill the king and putting the king's blood on them, Lady Macbeth will frame the guards. It is now time for Macbeth to stab the king. Though he has bad visions and feelings, he does go through and kills the king. Afterwards, he's troubled. He says, "I'm afraid to think what I have done. Look on it again, I dare not." So the next morning, the murder is, of course, blamed on the guards. So Macbeth kills them before they can protest, explaining that he killed them just out of rage and justice for the king. The king's sons, however, are still fearful for their lives, and they run away. So, because they're not here and the king is dead, Macbeth is then crowned king. Macbeth knows that Banquo is kind of suspicious of him. After all, he heard the three witches, and so he's kind of wondering. So when Macbeth learns that Banquo and his son are out riding, he sends men out to kill the two of them. They're only half successful in their job, and Banquo's son Fleance escapes. Meanwhile, at Macbeth's ball, the seat for Banquo is empty because he's been killed. He's dead. Now, in the empty seat, the ghost of Banquo appears, which frightens Macbeth badly. Now, Macbeth also learns that King Duncan's son Malcolm and Lord Macduff are attempting to kill him. So unsure of what to do, he visits the three witches again, and the witches, along with their queen Hecate, have planned what they will tell Macbeth in order to destroy him. So they prepare a brew and they sing the famous lines, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. So when Macbeth arrives, they give him false hope by telling him three things. First, they say to beware of Macduff. Second, none of women born shall harm Macbeth. And third, Macbeth will not be conquered until Birnam Wood comes to the hill of Dunsinane. They also tell Macbeth that Banquo's descendants will become kings. So Macduff has left for England, and Macbeth sends people to kill his wife and children. Now in England, Macduff befriends the dead king's son Malcolm, and they're sure of the other's loyalty. So then Lady Macbeth has begun sleepwalking because her conscience is now weighing too heavily on herself. Maybe perhaps we shouldn't have rushed all these deaths. She tells about her crimes and the murder of the king, unaware that her doctor and the waiting women are watching her. And she later dies, we assume, from suicide. So now that we have a couple of loyalists in England, they come back through Macduff and they have come to defeat Macbeth. Now the soldiers carry boughs from Birnam Wood in order to camouflage themselves, so Birnam Wood is actually marching forward on them. That's the witch's prophecy of defeat. Macbeth then faces Macduff, but he's not scared. He's been told he won't die from anyone who's been born of a woman. But then Macduff tells him that he was not woman-born. He was, from his mother's womb, untimely ripped. Now when Macbeth realizes that he's been tricked by the witches, he gives up and he is then killed. Macduff then decapitates him, and King Duncan's son becomes the new king of Scotland. And lastly, let's take a look at some of the characters. So let's start off with Macbeth. He's a brave general under Duncan who unfortunately becomes too ambitious after three witches prophesy that he'll be the king of Scotland. After that, he turns to evil, killing the king. Then he kills the guards who are going to protest. Then he kills Banquo and others. Now, he unfortunately lets Banquo's son, Fleance, escape. We also see Macduff escape as well. And so they come back and they will kill Macbeth. Now, Lady Macbeth is an absolutely vicious wife of Macbeth, and she's even more ambitious. She's the one who convinces Macbeth to murder the king at that time. Later, she becomes insane from those wrongdoings and she begins to sleepwalk. She does tell the doctor and her ladies-in-waiting what she's done, not directly, but they do hear, and then she dies, likely by suicide. Macduff is also another general who was fighting under King Duncan, but he believes that Macbeth has killed the king. And so once he finds his family's murdered by Macbeth, he certainly has justice and revenge, so he brings an army and later kills Macbeth himself. Banquo is Macbeth's friend. He's yet another general of King Duncan. Now, he suspected Macbeth of killing the king, but before he could do anything, he's killed by murderers sent by Macbeth. His son does escape, and later on, his ghost comes back at a banquet to frighten Macbeth. Now, King Duncan has a smaller part because he, unfortunately, is murdered by Macbeth, who was one of his generals whom he had just promoted. Now, Malcolm, Duncan's eldest son, runs away to England after he learns of his father's murder because obviously he wants to escape the same fate, and eventually he becomes the King of Scotland at the end of the play. The three witches are also prominent characters because they're the ones to tell Macbeth that he's to become king, which leads him to becoming evil. He wants to get to be king right now. They also tell him he'll be defeated, but they disguise it in a way as to give him false confidence. They don't lie to Macbeth, but they give him such a roundabout answer that he's unable to figure out what their prophecy is until it's too late. Now we have Fleance, who's Banquo's son. He survives Macbeth's attempt to murder him, and at the end of the play, Fleance's whereabouts are just unknown. Presumably, he may come to rule Scotland because the witches had prophesied that Banquo's sons will sit on the Scottish throne. So even though it seems to be a loose end, we don't know what happens to Fleance. Presumably, Banquo's son will come back someday to help rule, or maybe his own sons will rule the Scottish throne. Now, Hecate is the moon goddess and goddess of the witches, and she directs the supernatural occurrences. It's a rather small part, but she helps to make the plan to give Macbeth false security. Other small characters that we have are Donalbain, Duncan's youngest son, who runs away to Ireland after he learns of his father's murder in order to escape the same fate. And we also have Ross, who's Macduff's cousin, a messenger who carries the news to the people like Macbeth and Macduff throughout the play. And lastly, we have Lennox, another nobleman, who is suspicious of the murder of the king. Basically, they're just to give us some narrative. Well, there is your introduction for Macbeth. I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have any further questions, don't forget you have the comments down below. Please leave a comment, or maybe leave a comment and tell me what other Shakespearean plays you'd like to hear. And if you like what you saw, I would love it if you could subscribe to the channel. Thanks for stopping by.